Hello and welcome. Today we'll focus on the reading comprehension section of the GMAT. One of the most tricky section simply because good reading does not affect your score only on the reading comprehension section but also on the sentence correction, critical reasoning, and not just that, even on the math section. Because if you shave off a second reading a math question, that's a second extra for you on the test. So good reading is really critical for the GMAT test. Now there are two key things you can do depending on how much time you have for the test. If you have a couple of months, then you initially need to focus on improving your reading speed in general. Forget the GMAT, just focus on improving your reading speed. And in this session, we'll take a quick look at how you can do that, and then focus on what is it that you need to get a high score on the GMAT RC section. So things like question types, what kind of words, keywords to look out for, and then we'll actually go and solve a few questions on reading comprehension. One of the main causes of slow reading is that we read with our ears instead of with our eyes. Simply means we try to say out words either aloud, as kids probably do, or if we don't speak them out aloud, we speak them aloud in our minds. So that is one of the key reasons why we read slow, and this process is called subvocalization or vocalization. If you remember, the kids are taught to read by speaking out the sounds and the words. That is called vocalization. But many of us, even when we grow older, continue with that habit, although we don't move our lips, but we repeat the sound of the words we are reading in our heads, and that leads to slower reading. Remember, vision is faster and more powerful than hearing, and by becoming a more visual reader, you will instantly increase your reading speed. Some of the factors that reduce your reading speed are limited perceptual span, which basically means you read word by word, and then slowness of recognition, vocalization that we just discussed, faulty eye movements including accuracy in placement of the page, regression, going back to what you've just read, lack of practice. The best way to improve your reading is to read more, and that is something you can easily do if you have a couple of months for the test. And then this is basically a stress factor. You are so focused on getting the answers right that you may not be able to absorb what you're reading. Out of many, one of the key traits of a fast reader is that he or she, they look at groups of words rather than individual words, and that makes them read much faster by not focusing on individual words but trying to get the idea from a group of words at one go. And if you have a few months, then possibly the best thing you could do is to get yourself a copy of How to Read Faster and Better by Norman Lewis, available on Amazon, and that will help you improve your reading speed a great deal. It can even double or treble your reading speed in a couple of weeks to months. So now we focus on the test and specifically how to improve your performance in the RC section. So let's quickly look at what types of passages do you actually get. These are various types. It can be a data driven passage, which means a lot of facts and figures, and normally it's quite easy to find the answer because there are no two opinions. You can't really argue with a number. Then you have descriptive passages. In a sense, these are similar to the data-driven passages, but they talk more about a situation of, could be a case study or describe a scientific phenomena, etc. And then you have the most difficult one, which is the analytical, abstract passages. They usually start with stating an issue, and then they draw critically analyze its plus and minus points and draw out differences, or could lead to a new conclusion than initially stated, and so on. And these are normally the toughest passages on the test. And depending on the type of passage you get, you should vary your reading speed. There is no one size fits all strategy here. You can't speed read your way through an abstruse passage with many conflicting theories and arguments, etc. So depending on the passage and your comfort with the subject matter, you have to and you should vary your speed so that you understand it the best. Typically, the subject matter is taken from social sciences, natural science, or humanities. So if you have an engineering background, for example, you will find topics that relate to physics, chemistry, any science subject to be fairly easy compared to the other subjects. So depending on your familiarity and your background, you may find one or the other topic more difficult. So now we talk about question types and strategies for tackling them. Broadly speaking, there are two question types, explicit and implicit. Explicit ones are the easiest to solve because there is no chance of getting confused. The answer is right there in the passage. Whereas implicit question types means you have to derive the correct answer based on what the passage says. So let's look at 6 most important types of questions and the best strategy to tackle each of those. The first 3 types of questions are main idea question, primary purpose, and passage title, and the strategy for each of these 3 is very similar. What you need to do is to look out for conclusion words like therefore, thus, so, hence, because these kind of summarize the various arguments that the author might have made in the passage, and hence lead you towards the main idea or the primary purpose or even the title of the passage. What you need to be clear though is eliminate answer choices that are too broad or too specific. And this is a typical problem you face when the passages get more difficult and the test makers on purpose put 2 answer choices which are very similar, but one of them just goes too broad or too specific than what the author intended. Then you have the specific detail or target questions, probably the most easiest on this on the test because the answer is right there in the passage and you do not have to either go beyond the passage or try to infer what the author is trying to say and so on. So you need to simply find out the correct line number or the place in the passage where the answer lies. The next question type is inference type, probably the most difficult, contrary to the specific question type that we saw earlier. And the questions here can be running like it can be inferred that the author makes the following assumption. What is the assumption underlying? Which of the following, if true, would most strengthen the hypothesis, etc. Some of these questions type also appear in other sections of the test, like critical reasoning, for example. The way to deal with these kind of questions is go to the passage and to the specific line or the sentence mentioned in the question, and then read one line below and one line above of the line in question, and that'll give you an idea what the author is trying to say, and hopefully you can then infer the right answer from there onwards. You need to make sure though that the answer you select does not contradict the main idea of the passage. Then you have the attitude questions, which could be, for example, the author's attitude towards XYZ theory could best be described as one of. And here you need to look at descriptive words, things like adjectives or adverbs that could tell you the author's attitude. And then again, once we go to some of the solved examples, we'll see how to put this in practice. And then the last question type is around the structure of the passage, which could appear as which of the following describes the organization of the passage, or which of the following best describes the organization of the first paragraph. One function of third paragraph is to contradict, support, etc. The typical strategy is to reread the first line and the last line of different paragraphs in the passages, and that should hopefully give you a good idea about the structure. Now, all these strategies we've discussed are fine, but it really depends on the specific passage that you get in the test, and thinking about which strategy should I apply is not the right way of going about it. These strategies serve just as a background information, and really these should be internalized, and so you should automatically, depending on how difficult the passage is or what kind of question you get, you should automatically apply one or more of these strategies. So with that said, let's look at some specific passages and see how we best tackle. So now we move on to our first passage. You'll get about 30 seconds to skim over this. The idea is to not read each and every word, but to get an idea about what the passage is talking about. And then when we go to the questions, we will revisit the passage for specific pieces of information. If you need to read it for more than 30 seconds, please feel free to pause and read for longer. So here it goes. So we now move on to our first question, which is the primary purpose of the passage. So let's look at the answer choices and then revisit the passage to see which one of these is the correct choice. So number A, the first choice, number A, is compare and criticize two theories of tragedy. If you revisit the passage, you'll find that the first paragraph talks about the first theory, and the second paragraph talks about the second theory. And the first line itself says two theories have been used to explain ancient and modern tragedy. So it looks like this could be the right answer, but let's just check the others to make sure there are no close answers. So second one is develop a new theory of tragedy. Now what's happening in the passage is that the first paragraph talks about the first theory. Starting from here, the first theory states, with a brief introduction before that, and then the second paragraph is about the second theory, and then if you go down, you do not find any third theory. So developing a new theory does not seem like the correct choice. Number C, summarize the thematic content of tragedy. Now, even without going through all the details in the two paragraphs, we can say that this doesn't seem likely, but you can't really rule it out without reading the paragraph properly again. So let's just put a question mark against C for now and move on to D. Reject one theory of tragedy and offer another theory in its place. What the author is doing is he's starting off with two theories and then kind of finding that both have their flaws. So he's not really starting with one theory, rejecting it, and then offering another one in its place. Look at the first line again and it'll be clear that D is not the right answer. Last one, distinguish between tragedy and irony. Now none of the paragraphs, it doesn't even have a word irony there anywhere, so E is not the right choice either. So what we have is choice A and choice C, and between these two, A is certainly a much stronger choice, and even without reading the paragraph again, you can safely say that A is the correct answer here. Moving on to the second question, the author states that the theories discussed in the passage represent extreme views because their conclusions are. So let's quickly look at the passage and see where does this happen. So you can see this happens right here on line 3, and the author says, reading this sentence again, each explains important elements of tragedy, but because their conclusions are contradictory, they represent extreme views. The author states that the theories represent extreme views because their conclusions are contradictory. So that's a straightforward one. It's right here in the passage, and so this D is the right answer. The next question, which of the following best describes the tone of the passage? Now this kind of question normally involves elimination, which is what we've been doing anyways, but we need that more so in this kind of a question. So let's look at the first choice, which is dismissive. Although the author expresses dissatisfaction with both theories, it gives logical arguments and proof to dispute those theories. So while the author does not seem to be happy with either of the theories, he's not dismissing them without talking in more detail. So unlikely, but let's just put a question mark because we can't be 100% sure yet. The second one is ironic. An ironic tone would require some clue that the author means something different from what he or she is literally saying, and there are no clues of that kind in the passage. So ironic seems like a weak choice as well. Moving on to the next one, objective. So let me just cross out ironic, seems like a weak choice, and there isn't anything in the passage that suggests that the author means something different to what the words say. Objective could be the right choice because the author takes one theory and then talks about it objectively, giving evidence on why he's not happy with the theory, and he does the same for the second theory. So potentially objective could be the correct one, but we are not marking it just yet. Choice D, angry. The author does not really seem to be angry here. He talks about two theories to start with, talks about the first one and then the second one, and so on. So angry doesn't fit the bill at all. And the same goes for worried. You need to note that the author does not use any highly emotional language that would suggest either anger or worry. So essentially we are now left with two choices, dismissive and objective, out of which, looking at the tone of the and structure of the passage, choice C, objective, is the correct one. The next question, the author discusses the role of hubris in tragedy in order to, and there are multiple choices. We won't go into these now. Let's see where is this hubris coming up? And it comes up here in the third sentence. And does it come before this? Yes, it comes here. And if you don't know that what does hubris mean, the meaning is right here. It's a kind of pride. Hubris is a kind of pride. So the author discusses the role of hubris in tragedy in order to prove that hubris initiates the tragic process. So let's read this line again. Again, it is true that most tragic heroes possess hubris, a kind of pride that makes the hero's downfall explicable. We just need to cut out the words that don't really add to the decision of which answer choice is correct, to make things simple to understand and progress with. So I've just ignored this morally for now. So reading the sentence again. It is true that most tragic heroes possess hubris, a kind of pride that makes the hero's downfall explicable. But hubris only precipitates catastrophe. Okay, this doesn't matter. This tragedy is... So the passage seems to be saying that while hubris makes the hero's downfall explicable, it does not really initiate the tragic process. So in terms of initiation, no. In terms of explaining, yes. So the first choice is not correct. Second one, establish a criterion that allows a distinction to be made between hubris and sin. Now if you quickly scan through the second paragraph, there is no mention of sin at all. And you also see that the author is doing nothing of the sort of establishing a criterion. So choice B is not correct either. Choice C, counter the argument that violation of law sets the tragic process in motion. So let's read the question again. The author discusses the role of hubris to counter the argument that violation of law sets the tragic. Maybe, maybe not. Now can't be sure about this one just yet, so put a question mark. D, introduce the concept of external fate as the cause of tragic action. If you read the first line, the second theory of tragedy states that the act that initiates the tragic must violate human or divine law. Introduce the external fate. Potentially this could be the right one as well. So we've got two candidates. Last one, argue that the theme of omnipotent external fate is shared by comedy and tragedy. So just to put as a flow diagram, so to speak, what author says about comedy in relation to tragedy is that in a tragedy, hubris, pride, causes catastrophe. In comedy, humility makes for a happy end. That's all that the author says about comedy. So choice E, argue that the theme of omnipotent external fate is shared by... It's not really, it's going way beyond what the author is saying, which is this. So E isn't the correct answer either. That leaves us with C and D. So let's look at D again. The author introduces the concept of external fate as the cause of tragic action. The author does seem to talk about external fate in terms of human or divine law, but when he talks about hubris is within these brackets. Really, here it ends here. So in Cordelia shows sincerity, does not flatter her father, which could mean she's got some sort of pride, and so hubris. So hubris really ends here, starts here, ends here. So while D could be true, it doesn't really have any connection with hubris, which is what the question is asking. So D is probably not correct as the answer choice. It is correct as a statement alone, but has no connection with hubris. So that leaves us with C. Let's look at it again. Counter the argument that violation of law sets a tragic process in motion. Now, if you look at the tone of the second paragraph, the author starts with the second theory. He's not very happy with it. So it says, in short, cannot be reduced to what the second theory says. So second theory says something. The author talks about something in terms of hubris, and then the conclusion is that the second theory is not sufficient. So what ends up happening is that the author discusses the role of hubris to counter the argument that violation of law sets the tragic process in motion, which is the second theory of tragedy. So C fits the bill as the correct answer. Now between C and D, the test makers purposely made the choices so close together, with D being the correct statement, although in relation to hubris it wasn't. So you got to watch out for these kind of very close and confusing answer choices. Moving on to the next question. According to the author, Cordelia is an example of a figure who, and then answer choices, but let's just quickly see where does Cordelia come into the picture, and that is over here. So reading before Cordelia comes into the picture, let's start with this one. So this theory of tragedy as morally explicable runs into the question of whether an innocent sufferer is a tragic figure. They are, of course, although it is hard to find flaws. As an example of this, they are, of course, so the author makes a statement that they are innocent sufferers who are tragic figures, and to give an example, he talks about Cordelia. So Cordelia, author is trying to say, is an innocent sufferer who is a tragic figure. Potentially going to answer E. It kind of is in sync with what the author is trying to say, but let's just look at all the answer choices one by one. So Cordelia is an example of a figure who transcended both the laws of fate and the laws of society. Well, this goes way beyond what the two sentences that refer to Cordelia are. Cordelia sinned, but whose sin did not set the tragic process in motion. There is no mention of any sinning by Cordelia. All the author is saying is that she showed hubris, a kind of a pride, and that too is very indirect, and she was hanged. There is no sinning involved. C. Disobeyed a moral law but was not punished for doing so. So we don't know whether the law, she disobeyed a law first of all, and whether it was a moral law or not, really difficult to judge. But in any case, this she was not punished is wrong because she was punished. So C is incorrect as well. D. Submitted willingly to fate even though her submission caused her death. So she did die. She did so kind of willingly because she could have flattered her father. So you can say that she did submit willingly, but not sure. So question mark. E. Did not set the tragic process in motion but is still a tragic figure. Cordelia is presented here as an innocent victim of fate. So she did not set the tragic process because she didn't do anything to trigger that, but she is still a tragic figure because she was hanged. So E meets all the each of the elements of this second paragraph is in agreement with what E is saying. The closest other answer would have been D, but we are not sure whether she submitted willingly to fate or what, and So E is the correct answer in this case. So this is one of the most difficult questions you'll probably get, and just by eliminating the obvious ones, you can reduce the answer choices to D and E, and then you go to read between the lines to find which is the correct answer. But then the lines you're reading are just 3 or 4 instead of the whole passage. The last question in this passage: in the author's opinion, an act of humility in comedy is most analogous to. If you remember, we drew the diagram, so let's revisit that quickly. So looking at this, humility is same as hubris if you take a 1:1 correspondence. So humility is the same as a pride. Now let's revisit the question we have, which is here. So humility is most similar to pride, which is what this one is saying. You can read through the other answers to eliminate them, because there always is a possibility that another answer lurking around is a slightly better answer. So let's look at the first one. Catastrophe, no. Ironic action, no. C. Pride, yes. Aversion to sin, no. This is completely no. So yes, we have looked at all the answers, and from the mapping we did earlier, we find that act of humility in comedy is most similar to hubris, which is tragic hero's pride, really. And this is just to confuse. So that was the first passage. We will now look at a few more to see how we quickly get to the right answers and eliminate the wrong answers.